Hi everybody, this is Amy Kroll. We will go ahead and get started. First off, I just want to welcome everybody to the webinar by Robyn Dean. That's the Introduction for Demand Control Schema. And first off, before we jump in, I have a couple housekeeping things that we need to go over. As you all should already have up is the interpreter. And if you guys want a clearer picture, it's better to go to that little drop-down box and either pick fine color or fine gray. That will help keep the picture as clear as possible. And then also, if you want closed captioning, along the top there are various icons, and one of them is the closed captioning icon. So just go ahead and click that and captioning will open up. If you guys have any technical issues while viewing the webinar, go ahead and use the chat function, and we have a great team from the National Clearinghouse that will help you resolve all your problems. Also, you can use the chat function to ask questions of the presenter. Now, we will be collecting these questions, and then the last 15 to 20 minutes, I will go ahead and ask those questions to Robyn, and Robyn will respond. So go ahead and use that function to ask questions. Now, I'd like to go ahead and just introduce Robyn Dean. She has been an interpreter for the past 19 years, with most of her experience in the healthcare and mental health settings. She is also a faculty member at the University of Rochester School of Medicine, and she's been there for quite a long time, since 1999. And she is also the person that has been researching and advocating for the demand control theory among sign language interpreters. So we're really glad to have Robyn Dean with us tonight, and then several more presentations. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Robyn, because that's why we're all here.
Thanks, Amy. I assume, unless I hear otherwise, that everybody can hear me okay. My thanks to you all for joining and for being asked and invited to present for these webinar series. I won't spend too much time introducing much about myself, but I look forward to seeing those of you who join the online discussion so that we can talk more in depth about what we're going to be briefly talking about today. My first goal in choosing this presentation or choosing this approach is that I wanted to give people a broad overview of demand control schema. Most of you, if you've ever attended a training of mine, know that I tend to start with certain aspects of demand control schema and move into them. This is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be an overview of what DCS, demand control schema, DCS is, in a broader understanding of how it scaffolds a practice profession. How DCS can be used to understand interpreting and to engage in interpreting and to model interpreting after a practice profession mentality. A word about a term that I've used pretty frequently is the term translation. Sometimes people have the sense that the term translation is only meant to refer to written text, though if you look in literature outside of the sign language interpreting field, and even outside of the spoken language interpreting field, you'll see that translation is used quite interchangeably with the term interpretation. The reason why I'm using the term translation, or why I prefer it in some instances, is because it ends up referring to the final decision an interpreter makes, either from ASL to English or English to ASL. And that's the final decision. Interpretation can sometimes refer to still the mental process that we as interpreters are in before we make the actual translation decision. So I'll use that term to refer to the end product, if you will. I'll also talk about, when I mean me, I will say the word we, not in that royal sense of the word, but because I'm referring to my co-author and collaborator, Bob Pollard. So just in case you wonder if I keep saying we, who I'm referring to. And much of our work we have created together and published several articles on this topic. Let me talk about the title and why I called it Beyond It Depends, the Practice Profession Shift in Interpreting. First of all, it depends as a ubiquitous, common response to questions that are often posed to interpreters or to interpreter instructors or mentors around the idea of how do you sign something, or what would you do in this ethical situation? And the common it depends response reveals many things about our profession, and it happens wherever I go. I've presented in Europe and Australia, I've presented to sign language interpreters and spoken language interpreters, and I see and hear this common response of it depends. And I think it's interesting because I think there's something very profound about the ubiquitous nature of that phrase. I've been told tonight that my animation on my slides does not work in this function. So in essence, what you'll have are very busy slides. I apologize for that. I won't be able to move points up individually. So hopefully that won't be too terribly distracting to see the points sort of laid out. Also, when it comes to one particular place in my slides, I won't be able to show the individual pictures that have been added for the animation because they won't work. So I apologize in advance for that. Next time I'll know I don't have animation function. So let's talk about this title, Beyond It Depends, the Practice Profession Shift in Interpreting. First of all, let's understand what it depends means, the fact that we use it. First, the very fact that people ask us questions about what seem oversimplified, how do you sign, and what would you do if, seems to suggest that most people don't understand what we do. At least they don't understand the complexity of it. And I think that that's telling. It's also evidence of the reality that there are contextual factors outside of language and culture that impact our work. That is, that context matters. The people, the setting, the relationships that exist, our relationship to those individuals, where people are looking at the moment something is spoken, those minute contextual factors matter. And they impact our translation decisions, and they impact our behavioral decisions. The other aspect about it depends, and the fact that it exists, suggests that we don't have a common construct or vocabulary to talk about the factors in our work. And while it depends certainly is true that contextual factors do matter, the awkwardness of having to use example over example over example to try to convey how important these context pieces are to our decision making becomes problematic. First of all, it's inefficient. We try to house our decisions into examples. Now, I don't disagree that case-based teaching is very popular, and I think it's very effective. We use case-based teaching ourselves. But what has to live inside that case and be able to be distilled down to is a common structural aspect that remains true throughout every case, throughout every example. That structure is maintained throughout, so that when you strip away all the examples that are being given, what the mentee or student or colleague is left with is this structural thing that holds true that can then be generalized. The problem with it depends is that it's anchored so much into examples that it impedes people's ability to generalize it outside of that given example if that structure doesn't exist, or at least isn't identified. The other problem with it depends is that it's confusing to people. We tell people and talk about interpreting by using constructs such as source and target language. And we talk about interpreting and the ethics of interpreting based in a conduit or invisibility model. And while many people might say, well, that's really an old model, conduit or invisibility is not really true, I would disagree. If you read Cynthia Roy's article on metaphors, role metaphors, she suggests that even the bilingual, bicultural model is still based in conduit, and that we still, to this day, value invisibility as a profession, and not that we shouldn't. But what's confusing to people is that we say these generally static ideas of source and target language and conduit and visibility should be able to answer their question quite directly of how do you sign or what would you do if. But we confuse them when we say, well, it depends. And what we're suggesting is that there are exceptions to the rule. And what we're suggesting is that source and target language is only a piece of the story. In essence, what we are saying is that context matters. Whether you look inside the literature of spoken language interpreters or sign language interpreters, you see the same issue. You see the same idea of invisibility. And again, we might dismiss it and say, we don't do that anymore, or that's kind of silly, of course we're not. What is true behind invisibility that we still maintain and still hold on to as a profession is that we want our consumers and their interactions to be as organic and natural as possible. That we value self-determinacy. That we value an individual's agency. And so this role of invisibility, this value that interactions be organic, is how we have conveyed to people this ideal of let's pretend I'm not there. However, not pretending you're there, or pretending that you're not there, or valuing the idea that what would happen and how would people interact if an interpreter wasn't needed or the same language was being used, is antithetical to a practice profession. You can't have a practice profession that solely values this ideal of invisibility. What do I mean by a practice profession? Many of our publications spend time talking about the distinction that we make between technical and practice professions. If you see on the left side of the PowerPoint, you have a list of technical professions: accountants, architects, pilots, scientists. And on the right, you see practice professions: nurses and doctors, social workers, teachers, and police. Technical professions are highly respectable professions. But what makes them unique from practice professions is they work with constants. They work amongst things that have limited variability and are oftentimes removed from the consumer or the person who receives the end product or the end service. Technical professions work with math and physics. Practice professions, on the other hand, work with people and work within the context of relationships and interactions and socially constructed dynamics. They work within the negotiation of decision-making, socially constructed decision-making. If we were to say that interpreting is a practice profession, then we would suggest that we too, as professionals, need to understand contextual factors need to appreciate the socially constructed dynamics, and need to appreciate the relationship that exists between consumers and between ourselves with those consumers. Perhaps deaf people were not using the language of practice profession versus technical profession, but I would suggest that many deaf people have used the concept of attitude to explain the same thing. You see here the same individual, and yet she's got several different attitudes that she's reflecting. And perhaps what deaf people are saying is not that the attitude needs to be static, but that the attitude needs to fluctuate. Certainly in general, the attitude needs to be one of positive and respectfulness and openness and flexibility. But when it comes to the unique contextual factors, attitude and the flexibility of one's behaviors and how one interacts needs to change. Sometimes interpreters need to be playful. Sometimes interpreters need to be studious. Sometimes they need to be restricted within boundaries. And the context determine those. Again, to say that interpreting is a practice profession is to suggest that relationships matter, that contextual factors matter, that the social dynamics amongst individuals matter, and that the judgment that an interpreter brings, not just the blindly following the rules, but the judgment and the analysis of decision-making becomes a skill that is not learned, but is practiced and developed over time, like all other practice professions. If interpreting is a practice profession, we have to recognize the impact that we ourselves have on individuals and the impact our decisions have on individuals, deaf and hearing. I would even like to suggest that interpreting is the most practiced profession out of all the practice professions. In no other practice profession is an individual profession integrated into the gamut of experiences of an individual. We could be at the birth of a baby and present at the funeral of a parent, all in one day. If this animation were working, what you would see are a series of pictures that support the following thoughts. Interpreters are with people in their work. Interpreters are with people in their play. Interpreters are with people in their public lives, in their private lives, in their joy, and in their grief. When you try to reduce interpreting down to something simplistic as source and target language, and solely point to one value of self-determinacy, agency, etc., then you fail to appreciate the unique, the changing contextual factors that interpreters find themselves in. Niels Bohr, a prize-winning physicist, says that the opposite of a true statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth can be another profound truth. Why do I bring this up now? Because we need to recognize that if we were to claim interpreting as a practice profession, there are two profound truths about that. Yes, it may feel liberating. It may feel reflective and accurate to say that interpreting is a practice profession. That's sort of the woohoo of interpreting as a practice profession response. But there's also sort of a Oh, sigh response as well, which is that if we were to suggest we are a practice profession, then there would be lots of things that would have to change about this profession. Let me explain how I'm going to go through the next several slides and getting into the content of how DCS provides a scaffolding of interpreting as a practice profession. First, I'm going to talk about what it would mean to embrace interpreting as a practice profession. And just like Niels Bohr, we would have to certainly embrace it, but we would also have to abandon other things. You can't embrace something without abandoning other things. And some of these things that we would have to abandon are long-held habits and even comforts of our profession. I'm going to go through what the challenges would be or what actions would have to happen in order to follow up to this claim that interpreting is a practice profession. And then I'm going to talk about how DCS can be helpful in that. Now, part of the benefits, well, I guess not the benefit, sort of the downside of giving you a brief overview of what DCS is and how it scaffolds and supports a practice profession understanding is that I'm going to go through these constructs rather quickly. But you shouldn't be concerned because the format that this is designed in, the online learning, the follow-up sessions, the activities that you are to do outside of class if you are following us in that way, are all meant to immerse you in the very things I'm going to talk about. But first, again, for the benefit of being able to see the wide range of application, I'm going to go through these things quickly and use this format throughout the entire rest of the presentation. If we were to embrace interpreting as a practice profession, well, first we have to abandon the notion that it depends is sufficient and that it's an effective response to articulating the complexities in interpreting work and decision making. Again, I'm not suggesting that it depends is wrong. I'm suggesting quite the opposite, that it's quite true. We just can't continue to talk about the primacy and the importance of context as if it is something on the side, as if it's something, oh yes, and by the way, here's the exception to the rule. If you're saying interpreting is a practice profession, then the context is the rule. What would be the challenge for us as a profession? Well, we would have to, if the context is the rule, if the context is primacy, then we would have to learn to identify and articulate contextual factors that impact our work. We would have to expect that new professionals not sink or swim and learn about the contextual factors in the moment while they're working there and discover them on the fly, but know about them ahead of time. What are the contextual factors to working in an emergency room? Does it matter that patients are triaged in a certain way and that their conditions are prioritized? Does it matter that people are discharged, perhaps not having been helped, because in essence, the goal is to stabilize and discharge that person to an appropriate level of care? Do those things matter to us? Yes, they do, because they matter to the context. We would need to seek to increase knowledge of those factors and overtly consider them in the execution of decisions. And I would suggest that many of us already do this, but we likely do it in a way that is intuitive and that we've gained that intuition over years of experience. I'm suggesting if interpreting is a practice profession, part of the challenge would be is that we would have to say it's not enough that we learn these things on the fly, on the job, which our research shows most interpreters do learn their skill sets on the job. And we can no longer be content with intuition as our main way of making decisions. To embrace interpreting as a practice profession is to suggest that the issue of technical skills alone don't make an interpreter solely effective in an assignment. All practice professions have technical skills. All of us as sign language interpreters need to be equipped with the technical aspects of our work, our language modalities, our cultural knowledge. We have to have those technical aspects. We just can't divorce them from the contextual, relational dynamics that exist within an interpreting assignment. Just like any physician, that person, as a practice profession, needs to have their content, they need to have their skill set, their technical skill, but they also need to be able to have interpersonal skills. They need to know how to effectively interact and collaborate and judge their effectiveness. Interpreters need to be able to do the same thing. Technical skills, of course, are important, but they do not solely decide if an interpreter is effective in an assignment or not. Which would mean that as a profession, we would have to value interpreters based on things other than their technical skills. We would have to value their interpersonal skills, their social and judgment skills, and recognize them as vital to their skill base and seek to develop them in our colleagues and in ourselves. We would need to increase skills and knowledge beyond those of the technical skills, the linguistic and cultural realms. And we would have to evaluate professionals on their knowledge of the varying context and on the ability to ethically formulate, justify, and execute sound decisions. It's not enough to be a practice profession and expect people to merely follow the rules absent of the contextual importance. So how does the demand control schema buttress this idea that interpreting is a practice profession? Well, first, DCS needs to be understood as a taxonomy. And like all taxonomies, it has a benefit to it, but it's also artificial. As a taxonomy, we're trying to capture and understand and appreciate the important contextual factors and the interaction of our decisions with our consumers, but we have to understand that it's also an artificial construct that's really meant to get at something that is hard to get at. Like all taxonomies do, they are meant to access something that is hard to access. So what do we suggest is a proposed construct, just as a taxonomy, a way of looking at and talking about contextual demands. Now here's an example of something that we'll be going over much slower throughout the time we have together. Not tonight, but throughout the time we have together. So what we've proposed is that you can look at the contextual demands of a job, what is important to you as an interpreter, in 4 categories. The environmental category, things that are specific to the setting. The goal of the setting, why that place exists. The terminology associated with that setting, physical surroundings, and who's there. The interpersonal demand category, which is probably the largest and the most profound, and probably where you would find the majority of other scholarship within the field of interpreting, whether it's sign language or spoken languages, that most people are trying to get at the interaction of the consumers. But in our case, we want to make sure that we emphasize the interaction of the interpreter as well, that those things matter. The paralinguistic demand, that which is specific to the expressive qualities of the consumers. Examples might be accents, volume, pace. It's not what they're saying, that would be interpersonal. It's how they're saying it. Emotional tone or mood is another example. And last category, because we appreciate interpreting as a practice profession, is the intrapersonal category. That which is specific to the feelings and thoughts of the interpreter. As a practice profession, it would be a challenge to us to understand and appreciate our own emotional, psychological, and cognitive content so that we can ensure and work towards neutrality. We'll spend significant time on this construct because this construct gives us how do we talk about contextual factors. In this case, we're using the term demands, job demands, those things that impact your work as interpreters. We often refer to this set of demand categories as EIPI, or, if you will, the initials of each one: environmental, interpersonal, paralinguistic, and intrapersonal. Since we've seen in the literature that there's a lot of separation between interpreters, we separate interpreters based on what? Their technical skill set, the content that they interpret, whether it's legal, medical, business, etc. What we see with interpreters is this distinction and difference based in the linguistic aspects. And yet EIPI, or this understanding of context in this broad way, in this practice profession way, actually allows us to see the overlap of business interpreters with legal interpreters, or medical interpreters with educational interpreters, etc. We shouldn't be making those technically based distinctions between ourselves, because we actually share in common more than what these constructs would communicate. If you look at the literature, you will see spoken language interpreter literature mostly is where you see a listing of understanding the role of the interpreter. Now, unfortunately, in my view, this is conveyed as the role of the interpreter is conveyed as what the interpreter does. So while the literature might say interpreters do not solely act as conduits, sometimes they act as moderators, sometimes they act as clarifiers, sometimes they act as co-diagnosticians. As people are doing research into the field of interpreting, they're trying to call the roles of the interpreter how the interpreter behaves. I would disagree with this approach. While I certainly agree that the behaviors of the interpreter should be flexible, that sometimes we might break out of that conduit role, we might be more of a clarifier or a moderator, I certainly don't think this is the best way to convey that. Instead, we have suggested this other construct of what we call the liberal to conservative spectrum of ethical and effective decisions. Let me just explain what's on this slide. Again, this is a construct that we will spend considerable time discussing in other lectures, but also in online activities. But basically, the construct here is to suggest that ethics and effectiveness has been linked for centuries. The number one ethical tenet of medicine is do no harm. And in essence, that ethical tenet is a commentary on effectiveness. Do not do anything so egregious that it results in harm. And that there are a multitude of potential ethical and effective decisions. Not just one right answer, but several right answers. Ethics is known to be a discussion of the multiple rights within a given context. Here we describe decisions that could be conservative, or what we would define as lacking in action. So a conservative decision of doing nothing, which is in our view very much a decision to do nothing when a demand is presented. And the liberal end of the spectrum are to understand decisions that have more action. The interpreter is more observable. The other important take-home point of this slide is to suggest that there are dangers on both sides. That you can actually cross the line. You can be so conservative in a decision that it would be considered ineffective and or unethical. Or, as we are more inclined to talk about and think about in the interpreting profession, as with other practice professions, quite honestly, you can be too liberal, taking too much action. That's true, therefore, ineffective and or unethical. Let's look at some examples. Going back to our definition of demand, the demand in this example is that you are working in a group setting and the interpreter cannot hear the person who's speaking. Now, of course, there's not enough context there to whittle down to what one could do or what one's control or decision is in that moment. But here are some examples that you could do, regardless of the other contextual factors that we don't currently know, is that you could interrupt and ask the speaker to repeat. That would be a more liberal decision. You could give visual cues that you can't hear to the person who is speaking. That would be more conservative. You can tell the client that you're interpreting for that you couldn't hear. You could ask the whole group to please speak up. You could ask the person next to you. You could narrate and describe how the person is talking. All of these are examples of potentially ethical and effective decisions, ones that we really can't decide yet on because we don't have enough contextual factors. We just have the one demand given to us. But all of these are effective and ethical controls. Now you'll notice I use the term controls in the plural because the term control does not mean the verb control. Controls are best understood as options, as potential decisions or decisions that an interpreter can make, a response. Sometimes that response is as conservative as just recognizing a demand exists. Again, we'll talk about demands and controls and the concepts behind them more in depth as we move through these series of sessions and online work. But these were examples of how there could be multiple right answers to one demand, just as our slide here conveys. But they differ based on how much action they require. And that's how we, as a profession, could begin to talk about our decisions and options available to us. Not that conservative is better than liberal, or not that liberal is better than conservative, but just that they are both equally ethical and effective, and of course that the danger exists on either end. If we were to embrace a practice profession, we would have to abandon deontology. Deontology is a rule-based approach to decision making. It supports the idea that there's one right answer, and it's just our job as the interpreters, in this case, to find it in the moment. Deontology, or rule-based approaches to decision making, are perfectly valid ethical approaches, but they just are not used by practice professions. Practice professions do not start with the question, what do I do? Practice professions start with the question, what's going on? The context, the nature of the relationships, and from there make decisions from where they can consider their consequences. That is a different approach to ethical decision making called teleology, which would be our challenge as a profession if we were to embrace a practice profession, is that we would need to understand decisions in light of their contexts, and as a result understand them and their consequences, and how they play into the values and the principles of our profession. Another challenge would be is that we would have to reconsider our code of ethics, not as a list of required behaviors, but as an expression of values and principles. The values and principles that are stated for ourselves as practitioners and as our consumers could begin to see our values and principles. And quite frankly, those values and principles may lead an interpreter to make one decision in one context but when that context changes, make a very different decisions, because the values and principles are what stay consistent, not the decisions of the interpreter. We don't really know as a profession what our values and principles are, beyond invisibility, beyond self-determinacy and agency. We know some. Clarity is a value of ours. But we would really have to, as a profession, explore what those values are and how to appreciate sometimes those values conflicting one with the other. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. We would have to embrace this idea that a job has demands and that an interpreter brings controls. And it is that interactive dynamic between demands and controls that allows us to understand the context of work. Our occupational health data on sign language interpreters shows that interpreters suffer quite significantly compared to other professions from psychological and emotional stress of our work. Interpreters need to understand this dynamic between what's the job asking of us, or the demand of the job. What are those factors that are significant enough that they impact our work? And what do we bring to the situation? Not just our decision-making skills, not just our technical skills, but even things about our personalities, our traits, and appreciate those things about ourselves and our colleagues that understand and agree with a practice profession. It would mean we would have to abandon a more passive stance, a understanding or perception of work that job demands just happen to us. And we just sort of have to be in a boat without a sail and kind of be tossed back and forth amongst the waves. The challenge for this profession is that we would have to learn, predict, and ask about the demands of a given assignment, reconsidering the possibility that demands of given jobs are frequently knowable. I think that interpreters generally show up to jobs and are surprised. It's not what I imagined it would be. And I think to some degree that's the nature of the beast, but I think many demands are knowable. We do something with mentees in our case conferencing sessions where they bring their basic, what ends up being environmental demands that they know about of a job they're having next week. And using the constructs of EIPI, we as a group brainstorm, this is what you're likely to face. And it's amazing to see how much we can know. We're so used to, as professionals, figuring out on the job, flying by the seat of our pants, that the idea that we would spend considerable time thinking through what some of these demands might be is foreign to us because we've gotten so good at doing it differently. But we've gotten that place because of our experience, and newer individuals don't have that luxury. The challenge would be is that we would have to think in an overt and strategic manner to consider more slowly our decisions. We couldn't just decide to do in a given moment without considering what are the demands of this job? What is the job asking of me? If we were to embrace this idea of the interactive interplay between demands and controls, we would have to abandon the notion that effectiveness can be understood and evaluated based on an interpreter's action or inaction outside of the given context. Most of us know what another interpreter did because that finds its way into conversations amongst colleagues. What doesn't find its way into that same conversation is the reason behind why the individual chose that. The fact is true that the same interpreter might behave in one context and then when the context changes, even slightly, may make a very different decision. That is what makes us a practice profession. The fact that we consider and appreciate the important contextual factors. What would this challenge be? Well, we would have to validate and critique ours and our colleagues' work decisions, understanding the interplay of demands and controls. Not inherently in this right or wrong, good or bad, but really understanding and appreciating the consequences, the interplay between demands and controls. And that we would seek to understand the reason behind ours and our colleagues' behavior by asking them, what are you responding to? If you see a behavior of an interpreter and you say to them, why did you do that? The interpreter will likely go to the positive consequences and defend the decision. If you ask them, what are you responding to, it forces them to back up from the decision, the control, and to talk about the demands. It's a very different conversation to ask somebody, what are you responding to, because the person then begins to understand and articulate the demands. And sometimes it even opens up to them new and different controls they hadn't thought about. The next proposed construct that we're going to be spending time on is understanding this idea of a constellation of demands. None of us, as I said earlier, make a decision, a control decision, in light of the one demand or the main demand. I mentioned the one earlier about not being able to hear the speaker. Of course you can't decide if you're going to interrupt. Of course you can't decide if you should tell the deaf person and leave it at that. Until you get other contextual factors that we refer to as concurrent demands. Main demands are usually interpersonal demands. Something happens, something was said. And this is usually, quite frankly, what people pose to us when they ask us, hey, what would you do if? As a matter of fact, this proposed construct that scaffolds the contextual factors in decision-making is very similar to what we already do in an it depends conversation. This is a bit hard to read. But what it shows you is at the top, what we would consider to be main demands are the questions we often get from mentees or our colleagues or our students when they say to us, well, what would you do if? What they're usually asking you is the main demand. What if the hearing person moves into the visual space between you and the deaf person? And of course, you can't answer it until you have more of what we call the concurrent demands. You would say things like, well, it depends on if this is the first time it's happened. Would that make a different decision? How long the hearing person is standing there? Would that make a different decision? Is the deaf person a person who's likely to intervene? Does it matter what the person is saying at the moment that they stop moving and stand in front of you? Yes, it matters. Does it matter if you as the interpreter are standing or sitting? Does it matter how much attention the deaf person wants drawn to themselves in the interpreting process? Yes, all of those things are the things that we come to know intuitively about what to do in that moment. And right now, the it depends language is the only way we have of accessing our intuitively based knowledge. I'm suggesting we start putting those into constructs that, regardless of the examples, will continue to stay and be the generalizable aspects. What would you do if the deaf person asks you to explain his symptoms to a new doctor who just joined the other doctors in the room? Of course, as a practice profession, we don't have a one answer. We would have to know information. We would have to know, is this an interpreter who knows this deaf person very well? Is the deaf person's hands or upper body constrained by pain or other factors? How many times has the interpreter already interpreted the symptoms to other medical staff? These are the concurrent demands, things you already bring into your conversation. Main demand, or what would you do if the team interpreter you're working with suggests using a specific sign? Well, concurrent demands. Is it a sign I, as the team interpreter, already know? Is it a sign the deaf person is familiar or not familiar with? Does it differ from a sign which has already been established in the assignment? Which of the two interpreters has the most precedent with the setting and the consumers? These factors matter and lead us to decisions. I had an interpreting student in the class I teach at NTID say to me, you know, I wish I had known about concurrent demands when I was a newer interpreter. She's I think a third year, maybe even a fourth year. She said, because I was asked to go and observe interpreters on assignments, and I was highly critical of their decision making because I only saw the main demand. I didn't see the concurrent demands. And even as a team person, if I throw out a sign to my team interpreter and she doesn't choose it, do I have the ability to think to myself, I wonder what concurrent demands are true that are leading her to decide not to use that? And maybe it has something that that's something I need to understand as a practitioner within that individual. Excuse me. Here is an example, and because of the animation, I'll have to explain to you what the difference here is. And so originally this says that the main demand is you can't hear the speaker. That's the demand we've already talked about. And then here's an example of some of the concurrent demands. Suppose you were interpreting in a mental health situation. You have a group of 15 people, one person is deaf. Each person is taking a turn to talk about their weekend activities. And the person who is speaking is talking about attending a funeral of a good friend and weeping openly. That matters. Would you interrupt that person and say, I'm sorry, could you repeat what you just said? You'd probably be disinclined to do so. And yet, if you change just one concurrent demand, and the next speaker is talking about a good time they had with friends over the weekend, then interrupting that person would make good sense. But it would not make good sense in a highly emotional situation. You may choose to turn to the deaf person and say, I can't understand her. She's talking about this, that, or the other thing, and explain to him in third person. If we were to embrace interpreting as a practice profession, we would have to embrace professional responsibility. We could no longer talk about role without responsibility. Currently, if you look in the interpreting literature, you see people talk about role pretty frequently, but what they don't talk about is responsibility, though it makes sense. If invisibility and conduit is our main understanding of ourselves, then it stands to reason that we would say, be responsible for what? We're not even there. And again, it's kind of funny to say it out loud, but I think that's why responsibility, even though in every other profession you hear those terms as if they're one singular term, role and responsibility, and yet in our profession and in our literature, all we see is the role of the interpreter. If we were to embrace professional responsibility, we would have to abandon the idea that invisibility or self-determinacy, agency, is a priority all the time, and that neutrality can be donned, that it can be worn like a cloak. We would have to recognize that there are other priorities, that there are other values in our profession that sometimes we have to prioritize over invisibility. We would have to recognize the impact we have on the lives of consumers, appreciate that we do come to the table that we come to the table with biases, that we are not neutral, but that we have to work towards neutrality. Smith calls it disciplined subjectivity. He agrees that there's no such thing as objectivity, that there's no such thing as neutrality, but that we can be disciplined in our subjectivity. We could know and work within the goal of the environment as our neutrality. We talk about who do we align ourselves with. Do you align yourself with the deaf person? Do you align yourself with the hearing person? I would suggest that we align ourselves with the goal of the environment. That's the most neutral space. Why does that place exist? Because when people walk into an environment, they are on some level subjecting themselves to the goal of that environment. The reason why that place exists, and that we work within service of the goal of the environment and never seek to work against it. Work to know ourselves with honest rigor so that we reduce unintentional impact and harm where possible. When I spend time talking to interpreters, in our case conferencing sessions, I would suggest over and over again the number one thing that comes up is this distinction between what is an interpersonal demand, a demand that is happening between the consumers and myself, and what is happening internally. This is a career-long process to know what's happening internally and to make that distinction between what's happening outside of you. We have to continually learn about our own intrapsychic landscape in order to be able to say, wow, that's really about me. Oftentimes interpreters don't spend that time because we've been told on some level to don neutrality, to just snap our fingers and be neutral. And what that usually ends up meaning is that we stuff our feelings and emotions, and eventually those feelings and emotions come out in probably ways that they shouldn't, because we have no opportunity to talk about them. We have no opportunity to express them and understand them so that we have a safe place to deal with them, so that they don't begin to eke out into the interpersonal realm of the interpreting assignments. If we were to embrace professional responsibility, we would have to abandon the standard of formulating or justifying ethical decisions by asking ourselves, what would happen if I weren't here? Or, I'm just the interpreter, that's not my job. When you justify or formulate ethical decisions in this way, you are officially, by saying to yourself, what would happen if I'm not here, if I weren't here, you are officially abdicating responsibility. And I know why we do it. I know why we say those things as ethical tenets. It's because we value the self-determinacy. But again, practice professions all the time face conflicting values, and how sometimes self-determinacy and the organic nature of an interaction will come into direct conflict with clarity, safety. And we have to be willing as a profession to figure out, even though these values are still equally important to us on some level, one has to be chosen over the other. The challenge for our profession would be that we would have to link role with responsibility. We would have to define what our responsibilities are as a profession, which I've suggested we don't really know, because we have not really talked overtly about the values and principles of the profession beyond some of the very basic ones of invisibility. And we would have to educate our consumers about those responsibilities, about those values, and about those principles. If we were to embrace professional responsibility, we would have to abandon the notion that doing nothing is the most ethical stance. If invisibility, or I'm not really there, is our supreme ideal, or our supreme value, then it stands to reason that we feel like doing nothing in an interpreting assignment when something is posed to us, when a demand is set forth. We choose this default decision to do nothing. That's what the literature says. The literature says the default decision is to do nothing, and we suggest that's the most ethical stance. I would suggest that that leads us to understanding ethics as only ethical dilemmas. But ethics is so much more than merely ethical dilemmas. Many ethics courses and workshops base themselves in this ethical dilemma, but they usually start out with the interpreter having done nothing. When I'm talked to by a student or a mentee who's taking one of these courses or in a workshop, they will pose a case to me and they will say, tell me the story, and then they'll get to the point at the end of the case and say, so what would you do at this point? Right now we've got a big, huge ethical dilemma. And usually what has preceded that is a series of do-nothing responses by the interpreter. And so I have to respond to them by saying, I can't answer that question because I would not have let it get to that place. We need to be encouraging interpreters to think of ethics as moment-to-moment decisions, predicting the consequences, predicting the impact, predicting where this might go in a reasonable way, and let that inform our decisions based on our values. If we were to embrace professional responsibility, the challenge to the profession would be that we would have to appreciate that morality requires a discussion of right and wrong, and professional ethics requires a discussion of multiple rights. We would have to engage in ethical dialogues that review the moment-to-moment practice decisions we make, not only those situations that cause ethical dilemmas. That's a very different way of looking at ethics. As a matter of fact, Bob and I recently had published an article in a special edition of an international journal on sign language interpreting, and the special edition was on ethics in the classroom. And so we submitted our first draft, and the referee came back with the comment, I understand that Dean and Pollard's work is about decision making, but this is about ethics. How interesting. And it allowed us in the article to respond to that criticism by saying, right, in our profession, we view ethics not as decision making, not as moment-to-moment moves, moment-to-moment interactions, but as dilemmas. And certainly that's a certain kind of ethics. It's just not the only kind of ethics. If we were a practice profession, we'd have to move in that way. Here's our proposed construct. Our proposed construct is one about moment-to-moment decision-making. This construct you see before you is one we will practice. It stands for what are the demands, and of course in that case the D is only seeming to convey one demand, but I actually want you to consider that's the constellation of demands. The C, the first C, is meant to convey controls. What was the control decision the interpreter made, even if that decision is to do nothing? What were the positive and negative consequences? All decisions, just like Niels Bohr has told us, there's two profound truths. The positive, what we are compelled towards, what the value is inherent in that, and what is the impact, the negative consequence. And from the negative consequence, what resulting demands might emerge. Let me give you an example, very simple example, but obviously the complexity of this is much more room for complexity. But for the sake of simplicity and because we're running out of time, I want to just convey a simple example where the deaf student is looking down in a classroom when the teacher says, the chapters on the exam will be 2, 7, 10, and 12. And the deaf student looks up only in time to see 7 and 12 because the interpreter was waiting for him to look up and she forgot what the first chapter was. So the control decision is to turn to the teacher and say, I'm sorry, what were the chapters again? What is the positive consequence of that decision? What is the merit of it? She has a second opportunity to provide accurate information. What is the negative consequence? You can't have one without the other. What is the negative consequence? The teacher and the classroom were interrupted in their normal, organic flow. There may be resolution at that point. You don't have to have a resulting demand. But suppose the teacher says, oh, wait a minute, now where was I? That's a resulting demand. A resulting demand are those things that, in essence, interpreters, if you will, cause, or the decisions cause. Professional responsibility would just say, okay, so now what are you going to do? It doesn't mean we should go, oops, I've made a mistake, I've caused a resulting demand. It just means, now what are you going to do? Take responsibility for what you've created, not in sort of a punishment way, but in a proactive, empowered way. You might even say to the interpreter, or excuse me, you might even say to the teacher, you were talking about what's going to be on test number 2 next week. We'll spend time on that. Let me just say briefly that deontology Again, deontology being a rule-based approach to decision-making, and teleology being a consequences-based approach to decision-making. Both consider and embrace values and principles. They just do it very differently. And again, because the animation will not work for this, I won't be able to show you the animation. But assume we're talking about deontology first. A deontologist would say, what is the value, what is the principle, and create a rule to protect that value and principle. If my value and principle is life is precious, life is supreme, then do not kill would be my rule. That's a deontological approach. Now, teleologists, people who are concerned about consequences, take the same values and principles, but put them in a different place. Teleologists will say, what's the context? What are my options? Now, in light of the interplay between my options amidst the context, how do those differing positive and negative consequences of my different options compare to my values and principles? So deontologists and teleologists both have values and principles. For example, we could look at the RID Code of Ethics and find the values and principles that are behind the rules that are set forth. And we could take those values and principles and still use them teleologically, still use them in weighing of our consequences. So it's not that one has values and principles and one doesn't. They just use them in a very different way. So what would professional development look like within a practice profession? Well, we would have to, and again, the majority of our time over the next several months we'll be discussing and looking at these. So these will make more sense then than they do now. But for the purposes of laying everything out for you, to be a practice profession, we would have to look at our educational methods and make them akin to other practice professions. We would have to start the understanding and the appreciation of practice early and practice realities early. Medical students, day one, well actually day two, because day one's orientation. Day two, they start seeing patients. And I kind of saw a question kind of come up on the chat function, which I hope we can talk more about, but just quickly somebody said, how do you use this construct when a person doesn't have experience? You expose them, not through interpreting, but you expose them to the practice realities. They don't have to be there with an interpreter. They don't even have to be there with a deaf person. They can just be in environments that they're likely to work and have the lens of EIPI to be able to understand and appreciate the contextual factors that they will one day be working in. And I can refer people to other articles we've written on that topic. If we were a practice profession, we would have very different policies. Our codes of ethics would look very different. As a matter of fact, the Association of Visual Language Interpreters of Canada, AVLIC, has a very good code of ethics that actually conveys very differently values and principles, not a list of rules. I would encourage you to take a look at that. What does it mean to understand the implications of demands and controls? We would have to begin to expect people to have an understanding of the EIPI demands of a job before they walk into the job, recognizing those demands and finding ways to increase their controls. Case conferencing is an educational method that other practice professions use. Supervision is another term associated with case conferencing that allows people who have experiences that don't necessarily have to mean years of experience. I know an interpreter who's much younger than me, has fewer years of experience, but knows how to work within a legal setting and I don't. And yet she teaches me about the EIPI of legal situations. And so we begin to learn from each other through case conferencing. What would be the implications of professional responsibility? We would have to have standards and values and principles, not in behaviors. We'll spend more time talking about that. We can't say that all interpreters need to behave the same way. You can't do that because the contextual factors change. But we do need to be able to have some consistency in how we apply values and principles. But the fact that we as a profession have not yet articulated completely the values and principles of our profession leaves sort of a hole in this development towards a practice profession. And we would have to, in professional responsibility, embrace an idea of supervision or case conferencing, where we set forth the decisions that we make within a community of our peers. We're at the time when it's time for questions. I only have a couple more slides left that I would like to finish. It shouldn't take me too long. I just want to give you a sense of what does it mean to talk about supervision, because this is, in many ways, one of the huge shifts that I see as important to the development of this profession. Lots of practice professions talk about this idea of talking about your work and use and employ this technique of talking about your work. It's called reflective practices. You think about your work, you talk about your work, you share your decisions with your colleagues. Some people call it supervision. That's used in the field of psychology and social work. Some folks call it case conferencing, peer guidance, professional consultation. It certainly even could be considered an aspect of mentoring. The whole point of it is that you talk about your work with others for the purposes of improvement. Not because you're nosy, but because you want to do good work. You want to make sure that you and your colleagues can share in the important information that needs to be understood about the context. You need to be able to learn and share with your colleagues about the different ways you could handle a situation, the options available to you along the liberal to conservative spectrum, and of course, to be able to talk about the consequences and have your colleagues help you understand what those consequences might look like. Coakley, in his Exploring Ethics article in the 2001 Journal of Interpretation, says, the choices that we make and the actions that follow from those choices can uphold or deny the dignity of other people, can advocate or violate the rights of other people, can affirm or disavow the humanity of other people. Given the potential consequences of our choices and the resultant actions, it is reasonable to expect that we constantly re-examine those values, principles, and beliefs that underscore and shape the decisions we make and the actions that we undertake. The only way I would suggest that we can constantly re-examine our values and principles and beliefs is in the company of our peers. In our own heads, quite frankly, we can justify anything. But when we are asked to bring back our decisions to the company of our peers, then we are constantly able to be challenged on and hopefully also simultaneously validated on, as long as everybody's in a practice profession mentality, the decisions that we make and learn from those decisions. Reflective practice allows you to learn from your decisions. The term supervision is one I prefer. Some people don't like that term because it sounds like somebody is watching you do your work, but that's actually not what the term means. If you break it down, it really only means superior vision. And in this way, the group or the process of talking about your work is a superior vision to that in your own head. How we will go through this work is that we will develop a set of skills. And hopefully you will learn these learn these enough to be able to then pass them along to your students or mentees or colleagues. And that is first the identification and articulation of demands. the identification and articulation of controls in their broad definition, how to build a constellation of demands, how to be able to identify the main demand and the salient concurrent demands, how to identify and articulate consequences and the associated values of a decision, and how to hear the case or the decision-making of an interpreter and be able to identify, because it's not likely to be presented in this way, how to identify when you are hearing demands, controls, consequences, and resulting demands. So that's what we're going to be working on over the next several sessions and online. I want to thank you all for your time. It looks like we're in good shape. There is a last slide. I don't know if that's available to you here or not. It is. We're going to actually talk about this in a different time. It's sort of the common mistakes people make with DCS, but I'm not going to go over that this evening. We'll spend more time on that at the next session. So I would like to pause now, and Amy, I assume you will now convey some of the questions to me. Is that correct?
Yes. There is a point of clarification. You kept on using the phrase code of ethics. Are you referring to the current RID code of professional conduct?
Yes, and I apologize. Partly that's on purpose. I actually don't find any significant differences between the two documents. So yes, Code of Professional Conduct and the Code of Ethics of 1979 is what I'm referring to, but I would suggest that generally when you're talking from a values and principles standpoint, you have basically the same document. So I apologize. I do know that that's the term, but I get caught up in thinking it's generally the same thing. Next question.
I'm going to group two questions together, and one you've kind of already answered, which was, what advice or suggestions do you have for teaching demand control schema to interpreting students who have no interpreting experience? And along that same line, the viewer said that you're adapting a practice profession construct would decrease specialization within the field of interpreting, but how can IEPs or mentors teach all of the contextual demands in each area or specialty?
I would suggest that, again, our technique of what we call observation supervision is the best way to expose interpreters to practiced realities. And so I agree with you that when an interpreter comes in with interpreting experience, DCS makes sense to them. It's reflective of their experience. But I would also suggest, I have a class right now that just finished at NTID. I would say half the class don't have any interpreting experience, the other half does. And eventually they all get caught up with each other. I'm quite impressed of the sophistication that once the construct is embedded, how much students can actually understand human dynamics and human communication based on their 18 years of experience or 20 years of experience as a person. Because they're really able to begin to see and understand sort of the human condition and therefore the interaction and the complexities. But yes, beyond their own ability to conceptualize of those things, I would suggest exposing interpreters to practice realities, and I would suggest doing it in settings where there are no deaf people and no interpreters, because what interpreting students will likely do is hone in on the technical aspects of the work. And what's the sign for blinders go on. So I would suggest that you send interpreters in, as we have done, and I've got several articles on the topic of observation supervision, where you send interpreters in to practice realities. I would not suggest necessarily that it would make a distinction between specialities or content areas, because environmental demands within the content will be very distinct and will have realities that are very different one from the other. But what is likely to have significant overlap are the interpersonal and paralinguistic aspects. Is that I, as interpreter in AA will be able to recognize some of the similar, and by AA, I'm sorry, I'm referring to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. I will begin to see the similarities of another interpreter who works in educational settings, and the importance of group connection. So we will begin to share things and realities about interpreting that really go beyond the content, and yet at the same time, the environmental demand certainly allows us to house some of those important contextual differences that are dictated by the setting, or, and more importantly, the goal of the environment.
The next question are the demands co-current or consecutive?
Well, I think that there's some overlap within those two definitions, but to me, we just have traditionally used the term concurrent. So there are demands that are happening or are true, realities that are true at the same time. So we just have preferred to use the term concurrent.
The next question is related to the challenges of valuing interpersonal, social, and judgment skills as vital to the professional skills base. If an interpreter is unable to make good judgment or has bad social skills with their own personal life, can they still be an effective interpreter?
Yeah, I can think of situations where some of the interpersonal aspects of it are pretty limited. Not necessarily judgment. I can imagine that judgment really, is primary in this situation of interpreting regardless. But when you talk about social skills, a person who might not be terribly socially adept or comfortable interacting with people, I would imagine can work effectively in situations either where they're with a team person. If you're willing to recognize your weaknesses, or quite frankly, not recognize your weaknesses, but recognize the lighter side or the darker side of an aspect about yourself. So I, as an interpreter, am highly efficient. I like quick-paced stuff. I like people who are on the ball, people who I can keep up. The darker side of that reality about myself is that I am extremely impatient if you stick me in a situation that is not those things. And so I can appreciate and be realistic about my impatience if I see it as having another side to it, which is my efficiency. So I can predict, in light of those realities, not try to work to work against my impatience, because likely I'll be in some level sacrificing the other aspects of that, which is positive. But if I'm being validated in what I do bring to the situation, so this person might not be terribly socially adept, but they bring, high efficiency, or they bring great technical skills, then they would want to either work in situations where there's not a lot of interpersonal demand, there's mostly environmental demands, content-related such, or they work with people who do have, in a team way, they work with team interpreters who do have those skills. When I'm in situations where I recognize that I'm not going to be alone terribly effective, not necessarily because it's over an hour and a half, but because this interpreter brings something that I don't bring, then I'm going to rely on this individual. I'm not apparently a very nice person. I never thought about that about myself, but I can be rather blunt, and so I want to work with people who know how to say things really nicely so that everybody responds to them. And so when I want something done, I say to my team interpreter, you go up and ask for this, because they can figure out a way to do it nicely. So I wouldn't suggest that we have to work people who have good technical skills but lack in sort of the social skills, so we have to get rid of them by any means. But we certainly have to work to develop that aspect of them and to recognize any of the limitations, but that goes to anybody. We have to help people who are really good with social skills how to recognize when they're responding to their own psychological intrapersonal demands because they want to be liked or because they want to have friends, etc. We need to work, I think, as a profession generally on our own intrapersonal stuff and on our controls, and how those controls from a lighter side and a darker side can be developed and recognized and appreciated. I have to say sometimes to my colleagues, watch for when I start to get cranky and tell me it's becoming apparent, because sometimes my facial expressions will convey something that I don't mean to convey, and I want someone to be able to tell me that. So I think, in brief, that's how I would respond to that. But judgment, I don't think you can get away with not having a good development of that, even if it's a bit unsophisticated, or even if it's formulaic, like DCCRD allows. At least that person can work towards the articulation of those constructs.
All right, there are 4 minutes left, and I want to respect everybody's time. So any of the questions we have not addressed yet, I will make sure that they are passed on to Robyn and they get addressed on the listserv. And if you do not have access to that listserv but you want a question answered, just contact me and I'll make sure that you get the answer. So first off, I just want to thank Robyn for a wonderful webinar and for the introduction to demand control schema. And I just want to touch base on a couple of things before you all go. One thing is, and that Robyn has been mentioning, is the listserv. The goal behind the Marie Center and Katie Center putting on these webinars is just not to provide an opportunity for you guys to learn about demand control schema, but then to carry that on into other activities where you can really start to dive into it and analyze it and discuss with other people about this topic. And so we will be hosting a listserv which will be facilitated with Robyn Dean and Anna Witta-Merrithew. And that listserv is open to anybody who has watched these webinars except for students. Unfortunately, we can't allow students into the webinars or into the listservs, but the listservs are a great place for you guys to really start asking more questions and utilizing Robyn as a resource. So I encourage you all to do that, and in the email you received today explains how to do that. And if you have any questions, of course, you can always contact me. Just a couple of reminders. If you're watching this in a group, we thank you because it allowed us to invite more people. But remember to use the sign-in sheet so that we can track everybody who is here. Also, as soon as this webinar is done, there will be a satisfaction survey that will automatically open up, and we ask that you guys please fill that out. That will help us to make sure that we're meeting your needs, as well as it's the place where you can identify if you want CEUs for this. I just really again want to thank Robyn for this great webinar, as well as the team from the National Clearinghouse, Jesse and Mike, and the captionist Elizabeth, and also our 2 interpreters, Kirk and Darlene from Professional Sign Language, Inc. And just a reminder to you all, the next webinar will be August 25th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And registration will open approximately 6 weeks before, so keep your guys' eyes open for that. And thank you so much for joining us. Robyn, any last comments before we let people go?
No, just thanks very much. I look forward to our continued conversation. Hope this was helpful.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.